do is, just kind of get this thing kicked off, and we'll, obviously, it'll be more of a conversation. It's not really like a super, but I do want to give you a chance to go back, like as far as you need to go back. It doesn't really matter, take as much time as you need. I know the guideline says, 3 minutes, but this is your time. And I really want you to be able to touch on your extensive past, obviously moving through this industry and kind of the transitions you made from school to school. So, you can go back as far as you want to, like take your time with it. So yeah, Kelly Murphy, rock and roll.
All right. Want me to get started?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I'm Kelly Murphy. If we're going to go through the whole bio. So I went to undergrad at Cornell, and I played soccer up there, and I was a nutrition major. So my goal was to become a dietitian. So after undergrad, I moved down to Texas, completed my dietetic internship, and then proceeded to work as a dietitian down in Texas. I was there for about 4 years, and I started off in clinical there, started doing contract work, and then was like, nah, this isn't it. So decided I wanted to go back and be a collegiate strength coach. So I moved up to New York City and did my grad work up at Columbia University, got a master's in applied exercise physiology. And when I was there, I interned with their strength and conditioning department, which was awesome. And then after that, got a coaching assistant job down at Duke University. So I moved down there, worked with a bunch of teams. And after that, I went to a Division II school called Barton College out in Wilson, North Carolina. And I was there for a year, and I was an assistant strength and conditioning coach as well as the full-time sports RD there. And then I got a job up here at Virginia Tech. And so now I'm up here in Blacksburg, Virginia. At Virginia Tech, I work with volleyball, softball, men and women swimming and diving. And yeah, it's awesome.
That's awesome. And so what is your official title? Because obviously I know we can get crazy with titles here in the strength and conditioning industry. I mean, I was like asking one of my friends the other day, I was like, one of the assistants at work, I was like, I was looking through somebody's bio. I'm like, hey man, what do you think this title means? And he's like, well, it means that they're an assistant and they have some really, really solid responsibilities in what they do or whatever the case is. So yeah, what exactly is your title? And I know you already touched on the teams that you work with, but what is your title and what does that really consist of?
Yeah, so I am the assistant director of strength and conditioning for Olympic sports. So yeah, like I said, I work with volleyball, softball, men and women swimming and diving. And I think that we all have director positions here at Virginia Tech because we all are in charge of our own teams. So Brian Neal's our senior director, and he does a great job leading us, and it's awesome working with him. And then we each have our own teams that we're responsible for. So everything as it comes to volleyball, obviously he's there if I need information to bounce ideas off of, absolutely. But because we're in charge of our own teams, like he's allowed us to be directors of our own programs.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. Yeah. So you guys have some pretty decent autonomy, obviously, within your teams and whatever it is that you guys decide you want to do. So are you, obviously, because the next question here that I kind of wanted to go with is, talking about like what motivates you as a coach, but also how do you motivate your staff, right? So do you technically have a staff? Like, are you part of a hiring process? Are you part of intern development and things to that effect, where you're obviously working with some younger individuals, or not necessarily younger, but just people who are, in the developmental process, right? Along with, kind of the multitude of athletes that are always in the developmental process, right? So what is that like for you guys as far as the staffing hierarchy?
Yeah, so absolutely. So for our structural setup, so Brian Neal's our senior director, and then there's Ron Dixon, and he's our director. The associate director is Brandon Dillard, and then there's me, who's the assistant director. So we're all kind of working together. We have 2 GAs that work with us as well. And so all of us kind of help guide them in their programs. They help support us with our teams, and then we all feed them information as well, help kind of groom them along the way. For my role specifically, I'm in charge of our internship as well. And so we have primarily undergraduate, we've had some graduate interns that we've worked with, and they'll come and it's more of a entry-level position when I work with them. So I'll be the one who meets with them on a weekly basis, kind of goes over the curriculum with them, make sure that they're developing into a coach that they want to be. And like I said, we're an entry level. We're not someone who has like a professional internship. Ours is more of, this is the basics of what strength conditioning looks like. This is what coaching looks like, to give them kind of figure out if that's something that they want to pursue in like a GA position afterwards, or if it's another part of sports science that they want to go into.
Interesting. Okay. And so, yeah, so then obviously you are part of that, the developmental process, and you obviously need to make decisions when it comes to, what I call like kind of meeting people where they're at along their journey, right? So like your particular journey, and you were kind of hoping that maybe some of the people who are guiding you were potentially going to say, hey, like, Kelly's here right now, and this is what I think that she needs in order to move to wherever she needs to go next as far as information, concepts, or whatever the values are. So what is it that motivates you as a coach? And I don't even necessarily want to just be as a coach, like, because there may be things that are like completely external that motivate you, but strength and conditioning and obviously your role in dietetics and just overall nutrition has kind of been the avenue you chose to pursue whatever it is that motivates you. So what is it that motivates you? Kind of the thing that I describe is like, I say it on pretty much every podcast where it's like, oh yeah, it's like the thing that gets you out of bed, in the morning. And then I'm like, yeah, it's also could be that thing that keeps you up at night because you're trying to figure out a way to solve that problem.
Absolutely.
Right? Typically the case for type A personalities and people who are a little more go-getters, and obviously it seems that is the case for you. So what is that for you? And kind of, I'll ask my follow-up after that. So what is it that motivates you, Kelly?
I mean, I think there are two main things that motivate me, like specifically within like the field to pursue what I've pursued, from like nutrition to exercise physiology, sports science, like the optimization of human performance and the body is something that's like amazing. And I don't think we give enough credit to the fact that we work with elite level athletes. Like, that's not normal. What they're doing, the way they're performing, what we're trying to get them and encourage them to do is not a normal thing. And so because we're encouraging them and helping them, guide them into this very extreme position, like we're trying to optimize how do all of these systems within the body that correlate, like interact with each other, like how do we get those to work well together so that they actually perform at this elite level, which is really like an amazing feat if we were to step back and really consider what we're asking them to do on a repetitive basis for years at a time. So I think that one thing is like a big motivator from like the nerdy perspective, like that part of it. And I think the other part of it is like I said, when I went back to be a strength coach, I went back to be a collegiate strength coach. And so I know, having been a former collegiate athlete, like it's a different, unique experience. Being in college is awesome. Like I loved college. All the guys I work with can tell you I love where I went to college. I love everything about college, but there are a lot of different challenges and experiences and stresses that you have as a collegiate athlete. And it's different than a professional athlete. It's different than a high school athlete. And I think, everyone makes dumb mistakes and does crazy things when they're 18 to 22, 23, 24. And so I think like thinking back on that point in my life, like if I could do anything but go back and kind of like tell college age Kelly, like, hey, this is the way you should go about it. I think that's a big motivation for me of like, this is a really prime time to feed into these people's lives. Like these collegiate athletes, like this is a time to be able to speak truth into them when so many things are changing. They have all this autonomy they didn't have before. They have all these new stresses. And so I think that's a big thing for me of like trying to like help them develop as just people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that because I was just sitting the other day kind of watching our freshmen go through their training session, and it's just like, we have one of our assistant coaches is in charge of programming for our freshman footballers. And I was sitting there talking to one of the athletic trainers, and I'm like, man, I can't believe, like I'm 29 now, and I was like, I can't believe when I was 17 to 18 years old, like this is what I was looking at, right? Like I was watching some individuals who are 17 to 18 years old. They're on a college campus for the first time in their life, potentially away from home for the first time in their life. Not only are they being asked to adhere to a completely different operation as far as training protocols and just, values, beliefs, whatever it is that we're trying to implement within our department. But on top of that, there's the football responsibility. There's the responsibility of, the social aspect, right? Which is a completely different. I mean,
Yep.
I'm the oldest of 5 boys in my family. So I was the first one to go to college. And so like I had no idea when, my mom being from Italy, it was like, I went off to college. I was like away from home for the first time or just like on my own. And I mean, like you said, it's like, we all know what we're saying. It's like some of the mistakes you make, you look back and like, what was I thinking? You know what I mean? It's just like to be able to kind of guide someone through that and not just the social aspect, but also, the emotional aspect. And not to mention that these freshmen are doing it in the year 2020 with everything going on, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like the amount of stress that's like, it's crazy. Yeah. The things like to think back and like the things that I cared about and the things that I thought were important when I was 18, now I'm like, oh my gosh, like if I could just shake myself and be like, hey, look at it from this perspective, like take a step back. I mean, I think a lot of people, I feel like I've had this conversation a lot recently, is so many things would be improved in life and like help us if we just like took a breath and took a step back, you know, and looked at the big picture of things. And I think that so often we get stuck in this bubble, whether it's within your job and strength and conditioning and sports, athletics, social, whatever it is, you get pigeoned into this. You can only see an inch in front of you. And if you just took a step back and looked at the big picture of so many things, it would make a lot of other things kind of fall into place and put it in perspective for like life in general. And it would help so much.
Yeah, and which is an extremely difficult task to do. I mean, think about I'm 29, and I still find that, you know, I'm just starting to come into that place where I can really detach from whatever it is that I feel like I'm completely, like you said, like pigeonholed into as far as that mental state. You know, it's like you think about it, and you're like, you know, and so yeah, it's an extremely difficult task to do, and it's extremely difficult to do right now because there's so much uncertainty and volatility kind of surrounding what we're doing on a daily basis. But yeah, it's extremely interesting, and you obviously be able to have that impact, especially at a high level scale, like you talk about at Virginia Tech. And you know what we're really talking about here, going back to, you know, what you first mentioned, to some of those like intrinsic factors, like figuring out ways, like all of the different systems that are taking place within the body and all the different models that we have to come up with, that we try to, you know, marry all of these elements intrinsically. Do you, as somebody who also has, you know, a ton of experience in nutrition, and you kind of are, it seems to me like you see, we're talking big picture, we're talking all of the global aspects, like every single aspect that we just mentioned, right? Not just the physical prep, not just the, you know, obviously the nutrition or the psychological foundation or whatever, whether it be the technical, tactical stuff. Like, do you also see and sort of gravitate towards that interest where it's like, yes, we have all these systems within the body that we would love to figure out how complex it is and how amazing and how unbelievable what these athletes are actually doing. If you know, like I worked with women's lacrosse last year, and I take a step back sometimes, and I just watch some of their games on film, and I'm like, these are, like, I have to remind myself, like, these are Division I athletes that you're working with here. Like, they're doing something amazing that you just, like, I can't fathom. I wasn't a Division I athlete, unfortunately. So, you know what I mean? It's just some of these things are extremely unbelievable. And so, you know, back to the question, like, are there ways where you're like, all right, I have all these systems inside the body. I want to figure out a way to bring them all together and you know, have that meshing and that complementary mechanism take place. But now it's like, here are all of the different kind of, you know, categories that these things fit into, and the different ways of, well, is that something that you also kind of take an interest in and take a pride in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that considering all the different all the different things that happen within the body, like from the physiological standpoint, from the nutrition stuff, like it's so interesting to think about how do we optimize this so that we actually get the best performance. So I think, so this is my second year of Virginia Tech. The first year, I think when you're working anywhere, you have to kind of see how things are run. You have to assess the situation, assess the type of athletes. And yes, you're making progress, I hope, but you're still in like a learning mode. And I think now going into my second year, I've been able to kind of establish like, this is what the athletes look like specifically here, and figure out, all right, what types of specific information can I get more specific into and start to optimize? Like, whether it's, and if I look too specific, you can get into all these different roles of like, I want to know all this information from X, Y, and Z. And so for me, my challenge this year is like, all right, I need to pick one or two things for each of my teams to be able to focus on, because I can sit there and recognize, hey, nutrition and this, and physiology from this perspective, and this, and power, and like all the different components like you talked about. But if you're focusing on too many things, like that's not going to help anything, and you're going to get too clouded. And so, yes, I do want to specify in all these different like intermingling systems. But I think one of the good things that Virginia Tech does really well, and I'm grateful for, is I have really good like teams collectively that work with the athletes alongside of me. So we have a sport nutrition department. We have athletic medicine that Division I teams have. So to be able to talk, all right, you're going to work on this rehab stuff, and this is how we're going to collaborate. And these are the nutrition things that I might see, whether it's in training, and I can have that conversation better with the dietitian of like, hey, these are people we might want to, like, it might be helpful to reach out to them, or like you might want to come to a practice and watch them and see if you're seeing the same thing, so that they can focus on those specific aspects. And then from like a strength and conditioning perspective, picking, like I said, those one or two things of what am I going to focus on with each of these teams. Whether it's this team, I'm going to focus a lot on, you know, their jumps and different types of load monitoring, or this team, we're going to focus more on, I don't know, power and mobility, you know, like,
right.
I don't know if that answers your question. That was a little bit vague.
No,
but,
it does. No, it really does. And I think and it's kind of like a, if you're everywhere, you're nowhere kind of thing, right? It's like, yeah, I want to focus on all of these things. I have all these things from like this holistic approach that I want to go with, but ultimately, like you said, you work with a multitude of teams, right? So like, whereas like I work with just football right now, and I have sort of like different ways that I think each like group of athletes needs to be kind of exposed to certain things and approached, right? Like I think like the psychological component of figuring out how to reach different types of athletes and who responds to what, right, is kind of where I think, we're going right now with the particular team I'm working with. But so going back to that, right? So kind of, this is a nice transition into creating buy-in, right? So you obviously have figured out a way where you have a thought process and you're like, well, okay, here's the developmental model I want to go with. Here's the plan that I would like to sort of see these guys along. But what do you do and what do you believe in from the training perspective that creates buy-in? Like, what are some of the things that you truly want to emphasize? I know you touched on them a little bit, but what are some of the things that you truly emphasize, like in your training process with each individual team? And are there specific changes that you may make along the way? Obviously, certain adjustments, I'm sure. So what are those specific things that you decide you want to hone in on to make sure, like, hey, year one, these are the things that I think are really important, and I want them to understand about me, and I want them to understand about how we are going to approach, the physical prep, my relationship and the trust that I create with, everybody else that's involved in this building, the technical, tactical, the psychological, et cetera, et cetera. What do you have a specific like kind of model for that? And then, has that changed a little bit in year one, year two, and then potentially moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, I think that my first year is just working on movement patterns. Like, these are the movement patterns I'm going to work on. These are the cues that I'm going to give you. And these are, and I think a lot of it is relationship building, right? That creates buy-in. If you have a relationship with your athletes, if you have a relationship with your coach, like your sport coaches, I think that is so valuable, because if you can talk to that sport coach, like, they're going to be able to understand what you're doing, and they're going to emphasize that with the athletes also. So I think that creates a lot of buy-in, is building. So like year one is always building those relationships. I need to know who I'm working with from an athlete perspective and from a coaching perspective, and just athletic department wide. But I think that mechanics are the basics of what I'm getting into. Of like, I'm going to teach movement patterns a specific way that may be different than whoever you worked with before, or it may be the same, but you need to know my voice. You need to know what I'm focusing on. And it may be different from coach to coach. And it probably is, because we see things from different perspectives, and we have different ways that we watch sport. So we're going to cue things in different ways. We're going to emphasize different things. And so having 4 very different sports that I'm working with, like, using that year to develop those movement patterns. Like when we're talking about volleyball, like, I'm going to work on like accelerations, decelerations, jumping mechanics. That's going to be a little bit more emphasized, versus my softball players. Yes, we're still working on running, but we're going to work on rotational power. We're going to work on heavier loading mechanics so we can develop that power. Like dive is a much more like acrobatic dance. I mean, it's gymnastics off of a board into a pool. So it's like, how do we create stability when they're entering the pool? How do we work on like their movement patterns so that they can actually like move in the way that they need to move in the air and not be limited by any type of lack of mobility. And then swimmers are very interesting because they have very interesting movement patterns when they're on land. So how do we strengthen them and move them in ways that's going to be helpful for their movement in the water, which is going to be different than a softball player who's moving on land. So I think that establishing those movement mechanics and figuring out how do the athletes I have, like how are they going to move best? I think that's one thing that I work on. And then for my athletes, I think one of the biggest things that I do year one is let them know that anytime they have questions, I'm an open book. Like one of the things I emphasize every single time I give them a new card or a new workout or anything is I let them know, like, if you have any questions, ask me. Whether it's, why are we doing this movement pattern? Why are we not doing this? Why are we doing it this way? Like, why are we doing hang cleans? Why are we not doing cleans from the ground? You know, like all these different questions, like that's super important to me for them to be able to ask, because if I don't know the answer to any of those questions, and I say that to them flat out, if I don't know the answer, it shouldn't be in your program. And that's what I believe. And like, sometimes, like I know as a coach, it's like, hey, I recognize this is not like the most helpful exercise, but it's not detrimental, but they love it. And like the team building activity of doing it is going to like help them a lot, I'll throw that in there. Like no one's going to ask about that. I'm not going to be like, hey, you guys love this and you think it's fun, you know, but really that's part of why you put it in there. Like there's a purpose for strength and conditioning that goes from team building, teamwork, effort. Like there are so many different facets in addition to just, hey, let's get you stronger, faster, more explosive, powerful, more mobile in end range positions, whatever it may be. Like there's a step that goes beyond that. And I think trying to emphasize that to my athletes of like, look, I'm here to keep you safe. I'm here to make sure that you are performing as long as humanly possible in your sport. So that's why I'm going to talk to the athletic trainer every single day to make sure we're on the same page and adjust things as you need them adjusted. And whatever I put in here is so that you get better at your sport. And if you have questions about anything that I put out there in front of you, ask me, because if I can't answer the question, I'm not doing my job correctly. And I think that by emphasizing that, like, it takes a while, but if you emphasize that for a year when you're first with your team, like they now know, okay, why are we doing this? You know, and I can tell them, hey, we're doing it because of X, Y, and Z. They're like, hey, I hate rear foot elevated split squats. I'm like, I'm sorry about that. But you're going to keep doing them. And this is why, you know, like, and so I think that's a lot of how I work with them.
Yeah, that's all right. So Kelly's on fire, ladies and gentlemen. That is about as good of an explanation as I could have asked for sure. And so essentially what you're saying, right, is there's this open dialogue that you need to have, right? And each training session is sort of, it's guided by this dialogue. Yes, you have you have this plan mapped out, right, however many months in advance, and you have these specific objectives that you want to get to. But ultimately, like you said, well, hey, if they come to you and say, look, I really like hang cleans from the power position, right? And you'd be like, well, I may or may not believe in those things, but if if I know that they believe in that thing, in that particular exercise, I actually may get more out of them just because of that, that psychological component that they believe that they're getting something more out of it. Like I've heard, I worked with a lot of specialists in my time, and they're like, I really like the hang clean, or I really like this particular exercise. I think it really helps, my swing leg velocity. And like, I could really get down in the nitty gritty and decide whether there actually is any sort of transference of the swing leg velocity, right? And like, that's open for debate, but to be honest with you, it really doesn't do that any service by me doing that. It's just to say like, okay, if that is something that you believe in, right, I appreciate the dialogue. And like you said, they need to be able to come to you. And I've been in places, right, where that dialogue is not allowed to take place, right? And obviously, as you can understand and as you can imagine, especially you being you and given what you just explained, that's extremely frustrating, right? It's like, well, I should have the security in my own mind and the lack of insecurity in my beliefs and the way that I should be able to portray and the values and the vision that I have for this particular program should not be held back by this is the way we're doing things because I am the superior here and you just need to listen to what I'm saying, right? Like how far do you think that really goes with any sort of athlete, especially in 2020? There's just, people don't respond to that, and I'd make the argument that even back in the day, I still don't think that was the best way to go about portraying or sort of communicating what it is that you want for those athletes. So that's an incredible outlook, honestly. And I think that that's probably something that I hope there's a lot of young individuals in, because I think that's tough to do when you're younger. When you're a young coach, you want to stand by your beliefs. You're firm. You're on fire with just like what you believe in, and you may have this passion. But then you start to realize that the training process is much more than the concepts and these things that you want to get across. It's this open, constant communication, this constant dialogue and feedback, and sort of like give and take with the athlete. Like the training session itself is almost like this. You're in like I want to call it like the war room, and there's just like, all right, hey, like we got to, we're going to tweak this, we're going to make this adjustment here, we're going to move in this direction here. So, that's, so how do you typically, because you talked about having like one vision and one voice amongst like all of your different coaches, right? You develop relationships with your sport coaches, you develop relationships with athletic trainers, you develop relationships with everybody else who is also going to have a hand in influencing and manipulating the physiology of the athlete. So if that's the case, how do you guys go about kind of, what do those conversations look like when it's like, hey, this is what we're looking for from a movement pattern standpoint or a movement skill standpoint? Let's like even get out of the weight room, right? You talked about some of the land-based mechanics that, differ from swimmers to other sports you may work with. And I've worked with some swimmers in the past, and obviously they live most of their life in the pool. So, they're buoyant, right? And that, it may change. What are those conversations like between you and the sport coaches when it comes to sort of, collaborating and sort of, creating this cohesion on how you're going to, what movement patterns you're looking for, how you're going to kind of assess and evaluate those, and the words that you're going to use to communicate those to the athletes?
I think it's a process, honestly. And I think it's going to be different with every coach. So, you have to kind of, in my opinion, you have to kind of like pick and choose what parts you're going to emphasize with the coach. Like once you start to have conversations of like, hey, look, this is my plan. These are the things that I think are important. This is what I see with your athletes. And this is where I see us moving forward. At the end of the day, like they want to win so they can keep their job. And I recognize that. And my role is to help support them in that. And so with them, I turn it into a dialogue too. Like, what do you think is important for these? Like, what do you see? And me being able to, some coaches are a lot more receptive to, hey, tell me about what that means or explain that more. And other ones don't want to hear as much about it. So it's little conversations over time of like, all right, I've explained as much as I can to them about this is important. And I'm going to go and I'm going to continue to train it. And I'm going to show up at practice and try to have small conversations along the way. And some of them are about that and some are not. But if we're able to work in the vernacular a little bit more of like, hey, this is what I did, or I see that they're doing X, Y, and Z, like that's interesting, and be able to tie some of the training in so they can start to see the crossover too. And then there are other coaches who are like, that's awesome. Tell me more about that. Or I don't know what you're talking about. Can you explain that more? And trying to kind of make it simpler. I know that one of the things that like with one of my teams, like the coach was really emphasizing mobility. All right, these are the things and these are the movement patterns. And so we were able to continuously have conversations of, oh, I'm doing this in lift and these are the things that I'm going to do in their warm up. And these are things that are aiding in X, Y, and Z movement pattern, and trying to use similar language when I'm talking about that. Hey, look, we focused on the hips here because explain to me how you want them to, like how you want their hip movement in this sport movement. And as they start to explain it to me, I can say, oh, okay, that makes sense. And try to hear the language that they're using first off with their athletes. Because if I can translate that, because they're going to keep using that. They're going to use it on the field or on the court or wherever they are. So if I can use similar cues that they're using when I'm at practice that I hear, it makes it easier for me when I come back to them and say, hey, look, we've started doing X, Y, and Z in our training. And it relates to this. And that way I can kind of keep that same communication going so the athletes hear it, but also the coaches can see the transferability of what I'm doing.
Interesting. Do you ever see any cues used in like specifically in their sport practice that has like forces the athletes to move in a particular way that you don't think is transferable to the actual sport on game day? Have you ever seen that from any of your sport? I don't want you to throw your sport coaches under the bus, by any means, but you just in general, right? Like the idea of because what you're describing, right, is like, okay, I want to take a look at certain movement patterns and see if there's any sort of transference, and we obviously create that communication that's consistent, right? And I think that's valuable a little bit. I was talking to one of my assistants the other day, and I was kind of like, man, I kind of still think that even for some specific movement skills that some positions may perform on the field on game day, I still think that there's a lot of value in them being able to perform general movement skills that maybe have nothing to do with how they'll perform, because I kind of go with the mindset of the more general skill you acquire, the more tools in the toolbox, the more you can then move forward and acquire in a more specific sense. So do you see certain things ever coached in a way that you're like, well, that actually isn't kind of how we would want to see that portrayed on the field on game day or on, whatever competition game day is, whatever the sport may be, and have that conversation with a sport coach on different ways that you think you guys could go about assessing or accomplishing that movement problem, I guess, or providing the movement solution?
Yeah, I'm sure. I know that's happened in the past. I will say I'm very grateful for the coaching staffs I work with now, because fortunately, like, I haven't had to deal with that at Virginia Tech. And I'm honestly, I know it's been the case in the past, but again, I have moved past that, fortunately. Like there's things that I'm like, I'm sure I've had those conversations, but I can't recall like one of them to my head, but I know I've seen and heard things. But I will say, like, at least with my softball coach, like I really enjoy working with him, and he's like, hey, look, strength and conditioning, that's you. So when it comes to running, I do the running. They're not cueing the running. I mean, obviously they want them to run fast, but they're more talking about different aspects of softball as it relates to running and the strategy behind it, as opposed to, hey, this is how you're going to run from base to base. And when it comes to like swinging a softball bat, like I can watch it and I can see it, but I don't know the technique of actually swinging it. So I'm going to listen to what they're saying, because he has really good experience with like people hitting really well. So I'm going to let him coach that and watch what they're doing, and then be able to utilize that information when I'm in the weight room. And the same thing with volleyball of the coaching staff I work with now is great as well. When it comes to movement, like, yes, they do some movements, but the movements they talk about like at the net or in the back, they all are coincide with the way that I'm coaching them how to move.
Right.
And all of the different arm movements and different volleyball specific, like that's their wheelhouse, you know, like I can watch them and make sure they're strong enough and capable to do that, but I'm not going to teach them how to do that. I know how to teach them how to run and how to jump and how to land safely. And like,
Right.
I'll stick with the basics of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's like those specific, really unique motor skills that are just almost like swinging a baseball bat, maybe skating and ice hockey, you know, just like these specific motor skills that needed to be kind of sort of touched on and refined, like or maybe even just started upon like back when they were like whatever 6, 7, 8 years old, right? So that aren't necessarily as similar to some of the things that you might do in training, right? Whereas, you know, sort of jumping and obviously cutting and some of the more, you know, I don't want to call them common movement skills, but things that may have a little bit more of a commonality when it comes to training, like in volleyball, those might be a little different. But as far as, so going back to what you talked about with softball, because I'm really intrigued by this whole, the whole Altis thing where it's like teach them the rules of sprint mechanics and acceleration, then teach them how to break it based off of break the rules based off of how they'll need to accelerate and, you know, move from a, you know, via the running mechanics standpoint in their particular sport. So you have softball, which is a super interesting sport, right? Because depending on like the way, like the position that you play, right, will kind of dictate how you have to go about accelerating. So I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you might have, you know, like phases, like within your general physical prep, it's like I'm teaching them the basics, the rules of acceleration, right? And then it's like, all right, well, you know, there's rounding bases, there's, you know, sprinting from you know, maybe I'm just in a static position, maybe I'm slightly moving forward and then I have to go back and track a ball. You know, maybe I'm in a 2-point stance or whatever the case may be, depending on the position that you play. Do you get to a point where there is sort of that bridge where it's like, all right, we've touched on the general rules of acceleration, and now, hey, coach, let's take a look at film and let's take a look at the ways that our right fielder has to accelerate and move out of certain positions versus our center fielder versus our third baseman, right? Like, and I don't know, the whole like Franz Bosch thing, like, you know, the robust running. And so I don't know if you're interested in that stuff. That stuff is like, I feel like that is just super intriguing because you can sit there and you come up with like a ton of different creative variables as to how you would figure out and create some robustness and some stability with some of these athletes who have to do things that just may not, you know, appeal to the general physical prep, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think all of that is like very interesting to get into, and there is some differentiation as you go throughout the season, but I will say, having had one off season with this team, like we didn't get super into the weeds, honestly.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
I was still trying to assess them to a certain degree. And so I think that we did get into different acceleration mechanics, like base level and then building up to that. But honestly, we didn't differentiate that much because of where we came into, or where I came into the program. But I mean, going into this off season, if we have from August or September through when they would play again, like that gives us a lot of time to build off of, now having known, hey, this is what, you know, over 20 of the athletes did last year. Now I know how they move. This is where we can build from there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so swimming and diving, is there, do you believe in the idea of teaching those athletes to accelerate in some capacity, even though like the acceleration idea is like totally different on land than it would be the way they need to accelerate their limbs in the pool?
No, I'm never going to have a swimmer or diver run. I'm going to be honest. Like, I don't think that so they do. So I will say that like some swimming and diving coaches will have their athletes run. I'm not going to tell them to run, because I've seen in the past, I work with swim in every school that I've been at. I love swimmers. I think they're fun to work with. Their movements are so interesting. But having them run, I've only seen detrimental effects of it, of like, we're going to put excess amount of stress on your joints that are not typically used in this way. And for what purpose? I think that we can gain strength, explosiveness in various other ways. So if we're trying to do like an aerobic component of it without being in the pool, like let's put you on a bike, let's put you on something else where we're not going to put that much stress on your joints. Personally, that's how I feel. Or we'll do a circuit or something like that. And similar with diving is, like with both of them, we're going to work a lot more on jumping. And because if we think about a swimmer, whenever they enter the pool, they're still going, like exerting force in a vertical direction because they're extending out that way. And so I would rather work on vertical force application than I'm going to work on anything that's going to be, from an energy system development standpoint, just like my belief with track, I don't work with them, but like track and swimming, like that's what their coaches are kind of in charge of, unless they start to give me some of that. Like in regards to drylands and in the pool, our coach does a great job with that. So he's going to take that. Like that's his role. And my role is to make sure that like we keep them safe. We keep their joints strong enough so that they're not going to get injured. We try to develop them in that way, get them power and explosiveness. Like that's what I'm going to focus more on with that team, because that's my role within that team.
Right.
And then with diving, it's the same thing of like, all right, there are certain times when we do have to give you an aerobic base because you're still an athlete and you still have to be able to repetitively jump up and do twists and enter. Like it still takes a toll on your body, but doing a lot of running
in the pool.
They're always in the pool. Yeah.
Right. Like it's year round, I would assume, right? Like there's really never a time that they're not in the pool and their coach doesn't have some sort of input at some point, right? Like it's always
right.
Is that kind of the case?
Yeah. And for both of those sports, they're typically like, so for swim, they're going to have like nationals and Olympic trials and stuff. That typically will happen in December. And then they're going to have other types of nationals and competitions in the summer. And then in the winter time is when they're going to have the NCAA competitions. So they have competitions all year round. So they're always in the pool.
Yeah, that's super challenging, obviously. But I think, just kind of going back to my question, obviously this is not necessarily specific to your situation, but I do wonder, and I'll ask you this. Say you did have a swimmer who demonstrated some, maybe they played other sports, so they just have a different athletic base. It doesn't necessarily be better or worse, just a different one. They've acquired more skills through playing, various levels of sports throughout their career. Do you see, because at some point, right, like throughout the swim, and like my brother was a swimmer, so it's like I understand very little about the sport, and I'm a terrible, so my body is not built for swimming. I'm short and wide, so I'm just, what I mean. But my brother's like, yeah, I don't think you actually know how to swim. I think you just violently attack the water and you happen to move.
As long as you don't go under, I feel like that's a win.
That's my thing. I'm like, dude, I'm not drowning, so I'm moving forward. That's positive stuff, right? So, but obviously it was really interesting is when they initially come off the blocks. Is that what they're called? They're called blocks. Is that what they call it? So they come off the blocks and they get into the pool. When I used to watch Michael Phelps, they don't even really start swimming. Like they're down underneath the water, kind of like making their way through to the top. Like they still kind of like feeding off of that initial jump off of the blocks until they decide, because what I'm assuming is just gaining ground or like capitalizing off. I guess capitalizing would be a better word. Capitalizing off the jump until they get back to the top of the water, and then they're in the game, right? So if that is the case, right, like at some point, their sport does require them to move their limbs at as fast as a velocity as they possibly can, right? There is force production there, right? So is there value, and because I do this, I make this case, and I make this case with a lot of other positions, but they're still land-based positions, so this could be different. Is there still a value in saying, well, I think exposing them to pure like sprint abilities, like exposing them to higher velocities where their limbs have to move as fast as they possibly can, might be beneficial, although it's still an extremely general sense, because of the fact that, again, what's taking place and how the body's moving underwater is completely different than what's to be taking place if you were to be sprinting on land. Do you see from like a general transference standpoint, like there might be, maybe even if it was like 5 to 10 yard excels for a swimmer, and I guess like at that point you would need to say, well, is the velocity that they're moving at in the pool, like what is that, and is it transferable based off of the velocities that they could potentially reach off land? This is a completely hypothetical. I really had no plan in asking you this. I'm just thinking about this.
You're thinking about, yeah. Hey, I mean, I think it's a legitimate question, and I do think that there is, yes, working on acceleration training is important. In the form of running, I don't think is not a way that I would like to apply that type of training. Specifically for the athletes that I'm working with, from the facilities that we have, the athletes we're working with, I wouldn't want to utilize it that way. But like I'm saying, like using jumps, using velocity-based training, like we have 10 nodes that we've talked about, like I've used with some of the athletes as well. So working on different ways of increasing velocity and monitoring that. So whether that be with some sort of explosive movement, whether that's repetitive explosive movement or just one time, I think that has had more transferability for them in a safer way, at least with the athletes I'm working with, to be able to do exactly what you're talking about. They need to be explosive. They need to be able to hit that water and be able to stay underneath for a long period of time. And the stronger they are and the more explosive they are is going to allow for that to happen. So that's totally valid. It's just the way you go about doing it. There are different ways to do it. Running isn't one I would do, but some people I'm sure would do that. Like I do think that velocity like getting things at higher velocity to allow for that to happen is important for that sport.
Right. Yeah. And so, in going to the velocity-based training, so do you have any idea? I have no idea what kind of velocities these swimmers swim. Like, is there like this is a dumb question, but are there like miles per hour that like they swim at? Like, is there like somebody who tracks that, or like a radar, like how fast they move in the water?
I think that they do. I mean, I probably should know more of this. I think that they do. And I know that our coach specifically has talked about different types of velocity-based training. And I don't honestly know how they monitor it. But when you go to a swim meet, they will have like speeds there. And so whether that's recorded based on the distance that you cover and the time you cover, I would assume that that's from the touchpads is how they monitor that versus actually having a radar gun for them. But they might have a radar gun. I'm not sure. But I mean, they do. And then I know that there are other schools, like the more like old school, what I've been told, that's almost more of like an RPE versus for the water, is they have different like purple swims and blue swims and red swims based on how people's faces used to get when they would do the types of swims. So they would know how much to exert themselves. So I've heard of that too. And that's a little bit more, like I said, old school of doing it, where you don't actually have technology to monitor it, but that kind of gives you an adjustable pace for you to aim for.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Cause I guess at that point you'd say, well, you know, I could figure out, and again, I don't know how they would do, like, I guess it would just be based off of, the time that the time that you swam, and maybe like they could figure something out from like a meters per second standpoint. But I wonder if they did that, and then obviously, like, do you guys use Tendo units as far as the
yeah, we have Tendo units. Yeah,
Tendo units, because then you're just like, all right, well, I could just figure out, like, okay, I know that this is typically like their competition meters per second. Like, we know, like, maybe like team sport athletes can cover 6 to 8 meters per second. I think that's like, varsity high school level or something like that. If they can cover that, then, sometimes I question whether velocity-based training is actually having the transference from, just because the velocities that you're achieving in the weight room are obviously so far away from some of the speeds that they'll reach out on the field. So I always kind of question, like, well, I don't know, but I do. So do you typically like velocity-based training even from like an auto-regulation standpoint? Because I know those are like some of the other things that velocity-based trainers really stick their claim on. It's like the ability to auto-regulate what's done and certain times of the year and things of that effect. Is that what you use it from that perspective as well?
Yeah. So last year I used it a lot for that. And I only used it for swimmers specifically. I used it during their taper, so that the more elite athletes, when they were getting ready for NCAAs or ACCs, we were able to use it to be able to monitor fatigue, essentially, like, are you still able to hit these loads at this speed? And then I used that in season with volleyball last year, and started to use it with softball as they started their season as well, just to make sure that we could monitor them from a fatigue standpoint, essentially, of watching that. But I also started using it in the spring with our volleyball training, because I found that it was helpful, especially from a female perspective. Sometimes when females athletes get fearful of adding too much weight, I found that if I was able to give them, based on estimates of what they were hitting at certain loads, I knew what load I wanted to get them at. And so if I could give them different velocities, it would allow them to lift heavier weights, essentially at a higher speed, because I would be like, all right, this is what you need to hit. If you hit over that, you would need to add weight or whatever. And for me, it worked in the off season a lot with volleyball for that perspective, to allow them to kind of push a little bit more, especially with that female athlete perspective of being fearful of adding weight sometimes for whatever reason it may be.
That's not you though, right, Kelly? You're in the weight room, you're crushing weights, just smashing left and right, no problem. You played 4 years. I mean, obviously, that's the thing that's great about you. You played soccer at Cornell, so it's like you completely sympathize. Were you like, what was your particular style like when you were like? Was that the first time you were exposed to training? Was when you were playing college soccer?
Yeah, like I didn't lift before I went to college. And so like playing soccer, you always have people who are like, we'll do speed and agility stuff, where it's just like a bunch of, I mean, in retrospect, it was a bunch of like agility ladders and jump on a plyo box kind of thing, which I mean, probably still helped me some based on not doing anything. But I didn't do any lifting until I went to college. And then I liked it there. I recognized the fact that like, I'm not the most naturally gifted athlete. I'm not amazing, which is why I went to Cornell and not UNC or Duke or Virginia Tech to play, soccer, but I recognize
once I got a little short there. This is no Cornell soccer. It's pretty damn good, pretty solid.
Once I got there though, I recognized that so I was a goalkeeper and there were two of us that were recruited in the same year. I recognized if I wanted to get on the field, I needed to do something that was like above what she was doing, or else she was going to get the starting position. So for me, I was like, I recognized that getting stronger made me faster when I was on the field. So I was like, I'm going to push it in here so that I can actually like start, because sitting on the bench is not fun.
Right.
Always,
Right,
you know, like,
absolutely.
yeah, I'd rather be on the field.
Yeah. So like, how would you kind of like describe your coaching style now based off of maybe like where your perception was, maybe like you kind of outlined your first time being exposed to training, and then your coaching style, you know, when you first started coaching and kind of transitioning your way through, like, what is it now? Like, has it changed? Are there certain specific things that you know have changed, like on purpose, that you've made adjustments on, and or certain things that have just kind of changed, you know, subconsciously that you're starting to realize now?
Yeah, I mean, like we talked about earlier, I think the dialogue is one thing that I've developed over my coaching years, of recognizing like, hey, this is a dialogue, and I want to be able to have that communication with my athletes of, like, I care about telling you why I'm doing things, so you understand I'm not just commanding like, go do this for no purpose. Like, there's a purpose. So I want them to know a purpose. And then one of the coaches that I worked with before when I was like coming up, I remember him saying like, your team's going to reflect the energy of the leader. And so like, if I'm leading this team, I need to bring a certain level of energy, and it's not all my responsibility to create the energy, but if I'm leading it, I need to lead that energy. Like, I need to create it at one point and then motivate and encourage the athletes to be able to continue to keep that going when they're in the weight room. Because the reality is like, some people love the weight room and some people hate it, you know? And so I need to create an environment that gets both spectrums to be able to do what I think is important so that they can perform the way that they need to perform. And so I think those are some of the things that I really emphasize. And I think as I've gotten louder, which is, I mean, personally, like, I'm a pretty shy person, like in general, like outside of work, and pretty quiet. So when I was an intern at Columbia, I remember like one of the coaches I work with was like, you need to talk more, like just be louder. And so it's something that I had to work on. I mean, once you're in charge of your own team, you figure out you either got to be loud or you're going to suck, you know? So I had to say something to get them going at the beginning. And so that's something that I've definitely like developed more as I've gone through my coaching career.
Right. Yeah. Finding that voice, right? Like, that's something we talked about in the last podcast. And which is like it's super normal. I think as you become more, I don't want to say sure, because I don't think anybody's ever sure of the things that they believe in and they want to go, you know, I think, you know, when it comes to like strength and conditioning concepts, I hope some people are sure of the things they believe in other areas. But like, as far as strength and conditioning, right, there's so many different things. And so it's like, it's almost like I become less sure the older I get. And I'm like, I really don't know. I feel like I have a question for everything. Right. So, but yeah, that's probably something that gets you get a little more comfortable with your voice, and obviously doing what communicating whatever it is that you feel you need to communicate, just by, you know, accumulating that time and sort of getting a little bit more confident in the things that you believe in, the things that you want to express to your team. So I do, you know, it's tight with the hours, so I'm trying to get as many of these questions that I have for you in. But so I do want to touch on some of the nutrition stuff, because I just have a quick question on that. Like, so obviously you had a formal exposure as far as from an education perspective to the nutrition aspects, right? And I've been somewhat critical of the way that nutrition has been expressed or communicated to young individuals coming up, but it's probably unfair because my level of exposure to nutrition in the classroom and formal education is very, very minimal compared to, you know, the amount of nutrition exposure I have that's a little bit more abstract and a little bit more of like a against the grain kind of, you know, just some of these different guys, right? So like, what's your take on how things are taught in the formal piece, right? And then, has that changed, or is it different? Was it different from like what your personal perspective and your personal outlook on like some of the nutrition concepts? And, you know, I don't want to get into like, I mean, we could get into like specific ways of it, but like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's like, is that because like, I mean, there's so many different, like, there's so many different ways of doing it, and there's so many different belief systems, and then there's like different ways of operating in those belief systems. Like, what's your take on the level of like excellence or standard of excellence that we have when it comes to the formal education of nutrition, and then kind of see how is that compared to your personal?
Yeah. So I think that formal education, to some degree, it's not perfect, right? And there are a lot of things that I can say that have changed since I've gotten my formal education. I will say that like, I learned so much in undergrad. And the one thing that I think is helpful with formal education is it teaches you the basics. Just like before you go become a strength coach, like you should take an anatomy and phys class. Why? Because you need to know the basics and from like the most microscopic level to be able to apply the big picture principles. And so I think that's one of the things that formal education does. Like you have to take chemistry and bio and orgo and biochem and all this different stuff, because nutrition is biochemistry. It is biochemistry within a human body. And so I think that we need to be able to consider that. And I think that's super helpful. Once you start getting, so that is a good aspect of it. In regards to like the dietetic internship, like getting supervised practice, I think is the best way to be able to learn after you've gotten that fundamental basis, because you get to interact with patients and clients on a daily basis. You get to see so much stuff. And just like any sort of like supervised practice that you would have in strength and conditioning, like you learn so much more there than you do in a book typically, because you learn the book principles and all of a sudden you get to apply it. I will say that there are a lot of holes within education, specifically as it relates, in my opinion, to sport nutrition. And I graduated from undergrad in 2012. So things have changed since then. However, there is a discrepancy, I think, specifically within sport nutrition, that there is a little bit of a gap. It wasn't big back then. They don't give you a lot of information, tons of specific information, or they didn't when I was an undergrad. I will also say that like my opinions have changed, and the reason they mainly changed is, so when I was working as a dietitian, once I started implementing and trying to meet my own health goals and like at that time, like fitness goals and all this different stuff, like once I tried to do that using the information I learned, I recognized that that was where the gap was. I was like, I can't do it. Like, that doesn't make any sense, you know? And so I had to start to manipulate things. And there is research, just like any field, there's research that's talked about in the media, and then there's research that's not. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or bad. It just means that it doesn't have as much publicity. And so I think being able to go back and evaluate different research of things that interest you and evaluating the actual research, like, was it good data that was collected? Was it analyzed appropriately? What are your conclusions based on the conclusions of whatever the researcher said? And so that comes with being able to understand scientific articles and being able to analyze science anyways. And I think so that's definitely changed the way that I've gone about nutrition. I will say that in general nutrition, one of the things, I had this conversation with someone the other day, sometimes I think it focuses a little bit more on preventing illness, good enough to prevent illness, but not necessarily optimization. And I think that's something that I wish the general, and I'm talking general, so I'm not talking any specific person or sect within nutrition, because it's very broad. But that's what I found a lot is we're going to say, hey, look, this is like healthy, which I'm not going to get on my soapbox about how I hate that term, but as it relates to nutrition,
very relative term.
Well, yeah, it's an extremely relative term, but people will talk about what's healthy. And I think that we forget, like, all right, well, there's a difference between being good enough to not get super sick and optimizing our health. And if we act as though those two things are the same, we're missing something. And I think that we're off base on that. And I think that's sometimes where nutrition can get a little fuzzy, is we're trying to avoid stuff as opposed to optimization. And there's a fine line in the way that psychology interacts with both of them. So I will acknowledge that. It's trying to figure out where do you go on that spectrum in order to also make sure that when you talk about it, it's healthful from a mental perspective, because like anything else, it can get, it can become obsessive in a positive or negative way too. So you have to be careful. Like we said at the beginning, all of the systems interact, and figuring out how to optimize one, you have to consider the other ones as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good way to put it. But I kind of want to get on your soapbox a little bit. If we could just touch on the soapbox a little bit. I mean, so you talk about
on
the
idea
healthy? Of obviously, I mean, because I mean, like there's things that are marketed here in America as healthy, and obviously there's a ton of research that shows some of these things are actually not only not healthy for us, but they're actually extremely bad for us, right? And so there's all of these. There's certain levels of corruption or whatever we want to call it, right? And then obviously, yeah, like what's healthy for somebody. You talked about the idea of just simply taking certain things away is not necessarily healthy, right? It's not optimizing. We're just simply saying, okay, I'm just not going to eat these particular things anymore. But our level of understanding and exposure to the educational aspects of what we can do to not only just get rid of some of these other things, but also optimize, right? And get ourselves in a point where we're actually metabolically healthy on all levels, right? We would probably do a little bit better to, you know, potentially fend off, I don't know, certain things like viruses and whatever, you know what I mean? Like, so what is your take on that? Like the idea of healthy versus not healthy, and you know,
it's like you said, it's such a relative term, and I've tried to say this even before when I was working in nutrition, is people be like, this is healthy, right? And it was like their justification of why they should continue doing what they're doing, even though they've verbalized they want change, which doesn't make sense. And so for me, I'm like, all right, everything's healthy. Like if you're literally in the middle of a desert and there's no food anywhere and you're about to die and there is a bottle of orange soda sitting in the middle of the desert, that is a healthy thing to consume. Why? Because you need calories in order to not die, right? So that is a healthy thing. But if you're sitting on a computer for 8 hours a day, should you have that same orange soda? No, it's no longer healthy. So we need to think about the context that someone's consuming it in. You need to think about their environment. You need to think about their genes, which nutrigenomics is like such an interesting avenue of science. And it's like it's growing. Can you apply it in the collegiate sector? Probably not very much, at least at a lower level D1. Maybe in the future at high power five schools, potentially. But like professional athletes, yeah, it should be something that they start to consider. But we need to think about, like, everyone's body is different. Like everyone talks about, or not everyone, it's highly talked about in society of how important your gut is. Everyone knows your gut's important and it's going to affect your brain. It's going to affect your immune system, all this different stuff. We also know that that's made up of bacteria that is specific to that one person. So to think that something that we consume is going to affect our bacteria in our gut, and it shouldn't be, even though that's entirely different than someone sitting next to us, to think that our intake shouldn't be somewhat skewed or somewhat different than someone next to us, I think it doesn't make any sense. Like, we need to consider everyone's biochemistry is different. So we need to really think about that individual. What do they need to optimize? If someone has an allergy, something that might be helpful for somebody is obviously not going to be helpful for them. And that's a very specific, acute reaction they could have. But even from a wider perspective, someone might be intolerant. Someone might digest something faster. Someone might, prefer something else, and you have to work around them and consider their biochemistry, their environment, where do they live, who do they interact with, what's easy for them, what do they prefer, what is their medical history look like. There's so many different components to consider someone's like healthful eating or nutritious eating. Like, nutritious makes more sense when we talk about foods. What people are saying when they're saying, is it healthy? Is it nutritious? Is this going to aid in our nutrition and theoretically help our biochemistry? From a very general perspective, there's generally a yes or a no most of the time that can answer that question. Healthy is like weak.
Right. Yeah. Very weak. It's an empty term sometimes. And I think are you interested in epigenetics in some capacity as far as Kate Shanahan's book, Deep Nutrition? I feel like you've read that book based on the way that you're talking.
I haven't, but wait, what was it called?
Deep Nutrition by Dr. Kate Shanahan. You'd love that book if this is what you're.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that, but I'm going to add that to my list.
Yeah, you gotta check that out, and then let me know, because I mean I feel like you would be able to take from it a little bit more, or a little bit of a different perspective than I've been able to, and because mine's a little more raw. So like I take a lot of what Kate says, and I'm like I'm buying this. I'm on this train. I'm with this. You know what I mean? So, and I don't give much pushback, and it's kind of really changed the way that I approach, what I eat and how I eat, and, when, and all that kind of stuff. But it's all about like epigenetics and basically how, some of the things that we eat and the experiences that we have, and, from like, different parts of, obviously so like she talks about like certain things that women in the third trimester should actually eat in order to get the baby's head to be shaped in a certain, like, bone structures, and obviously, so like my cousin's wife was pregnant, and it was actually, the baby that they just had. I'm actually the godfather, and I was like telling him, like, hey, listen, so we need to make sure that we're having some fish eggs and some salmon roe. And she's like, hey, I'm not eating fish eggs. I'm like, come on, we need to have the baby with the round head, though. We got to have it's a good athletics, you know what I mean? We got these teams going on, right? So, I mean, it's all about how, like, it's
interesting. Crazy. And like, wow. I mean, so I think science is really important, but like I said, there's a lot of science that's not talked about. And I think that's one thing that I was kind of turned away from after school is they're like, oh, you need to look at these sources and these sources. It's like, all right, well, this is a valid article that talks about something, but there's only one article on it. Why? There's not any money in it. So like, are you going to find 75 articles on spirulina and its beneficial effects? Like maybe not, but I can find one that tells me it's going to do X, Y, and Z. Like why, if that's not going to be detrimental to me, like why would I not try to implement that? And it's harder when you're talking about like giving it to clients or giving it on behalf of an organization too. Someone you have to be careful about liability because there could be genetic predispositions that could cause someone to have a negative reaction. So that does need to be considered. But from like a personal perspective, I think considering like different avenues of nutrition, like even me, like I had a back issue in the fall and through the spring too. And afterwards I was like, all right, once we knew what it was, I was like, this is going to be my supplement regimen. This like did all this research to be like, this is what's going to happen. I don't want to take like pharmaceutical medication, but what can I do to aid in my healing process that will help me regenerate in the way that I want to from a more natural way that can be done through food. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's it right there. Like it really is wild stuff. It's phenomenal. And it's just, I think it's something that will, I don't want to give too much of the book away because I don't want to give you any like sort of pre-bias going into this thing. But yeah, you got to read the book and then I'll be interested to see what you think. But yeah, epigenetic, I mean, like there was things as far as like the different types of stress that we're exposed to now could potentially affect the way that, and then certain things that certain types of foods that we're exposed to as far as like, I like organ meats and all that kind of stuff. I like as far as like the potential effects that they could have on not only my kids, but my kids' kids and sort of the different types of genetics that they'll have and the experiences they'll have and things of that effect. So yeah, super interesting stuff. That'll definitely be interesting, I think, for you. But so yeah, we're closing in on the hour marker, but I do have a couple more questions for you I want to get in. So just from your career perspective and obviously the things that you can offer for young individuals coming into the field, if you can kind of touch on some of the resources that you sort of refer to, maybe whether it be books, podcasts, maybe some mentors or anybody that you wanted to kind of shout out that you feel has played like an integral part in your personal and maybe your professional development, and just sort of like some resources that you really feel strongly about and that have really guided some of your thought process, and then maybe provide, any sort of advice that you have for any young individual, young strength and conditioning coach trying to get into this field, or even a young nutritionist who wants to become a strength coach, so any sort of advice that you have for anybody.
Yeah, I think in regards to like resources and stuff, they're always, from our field specifically, there's some easy places to go to for regular articles. So like Simply Faster, Science for Sport, those ones are easy ones to go and just find articles that are constantly putting out content, and it's easy to go to them and start to look at their references. What are they referencing? And then go down that rabbit hole of like, what article are they referencing to? Same thing with like YLM Sports does a lot of good infographics. So I'll look at those and then go back to the articles that they post up and then figure out, is this topic something that I'm interested in? And then keep following those references. Honestly, I think that's the best way to kind of research a topic or go about it, is find an article you think is interesting, figure out what research it came from, and then look at those references that research article notes and start to see all the different things that support or go contrary to what it talked about. So you get a better understanding of that concept as a whole. I think that Cressy always puts out really good content. So in regards to like softball, baseball, I'll listen to his podcast and read some of the articles he puts out there. Same thing. So my softball coach turned me on Base U. They put out a couple of good webinars over like this quarantine time, which I think have been awesome. They have like Cressy on it, Alvermeal. So they'll intersect both like baseball and softball, like mechanics, and also strength and conditioning, which I think have been really good and interesting for me, because the guy really knows, he does TPI stuff. So he's really good with like biomechanics, which I think is interesting. And then the biggest thing I'd say is find people who are around you and talk to them. Like if you meet someone, talk to them. Like I'm really fortunate. I work with directly with 3 awesome strength coaches. I talk to them all the time. What are you doing with your teams? What have you just read? And I think just having conversations with them about topics has been so useful. And they have different perspectives. They have different experiences. They know different people. And so being able to connect through that has been, I think, helped me the most in my development. Like all the places I've been, I've had awesome people I've worked with. Like up at Columbia, like Matt, Tommy, Allison, like they're awesome resources. I think that sometimes people don't always talk about the Ivies, because most people go there and they stay for a really long time, but they have really good resources out there. And
Right.
They help me a lot. And then Duke's got a great staff as well. So talk to people around you. I know that also I'll talk to people and hear someone they reference to, and then I'll go on CSCCA or NSCA website and I'll look up past talks of the people that they'll reference. So if I don't know who they are, like someone was talking about the guy out at Utah. I've never met him, but I've heard only really good things about him. So I looked him up and started listening to his past talks. Because if people I think are smart are going to tell me this guy's smart, then I want to listen to what he has to say, honestly. So I think that's helpful. And like in general, to people who are coming up, I think watch, listen, and read. Like those are the things you need to do. Watch what the different coaches you're around, watch everything they're doing, listen to what they're saying, listen to cues they're saying, listen to how they're communicating with their coaches, with their athletes, with administrators. Like watch and listen to different people in the athletic departments you're in, listen to the sport coaches, listen to the facilities people, like start to understand what the workings of an athletic department are like, because it's going to be different in every school. But the more you understand how people interact, it's really going to set you apart as you go throughout your career, because all the people you work with are an important part of the team, like as a whole. Like it's not going to function. The athletic department will not function like without the different components, and you're going to need them. And I think it's helpful learning about communication, but also learning about the different people that you'll be working around. And then read, like find time every day to read, whether it's one article, whether it's a couple once a week, do something. But if you're staying on top of just reading little articles every once in a while, it's going to keep you on top of it. And I think if you can continue to take in more information, it's really going to, find a time to process. Don't just like drink through water, like a fire hose all the time, but like watch, listen, and then read every once in a while, and find a time to actually process that information. Because it's going to set you apart if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. Kelly, this has been a pleasure. Is there anything else that you want to add? Is there anything else that you need to get out there or whatever? Obviously, this is your time. So I don't want you to get off here and be like, I should have said that. I forgot to, if there's anything else that you want to get out, now's the time. But I do want to say it's been a pleasure, and I've learned a lot in this time. So yeah, if there's anything else you want to add before we wrap up here, the floor is yours.
Yeah, this has been awesome. I think we've covered a lot of topics on here. And I think just the biggest thing for strength and conditioning, we just have to remember like what we do is important, which is why we like choose to do what we do. But I think like we kind of talked about in the beginning, like every once in a while, we got to take a step back and kind of refocus and figure out why we're doing what we're doing. Like we're here to help support the coaches. We're here to help guide these college students. And if we keep that in mind, then I think it's going to do good things for the field. We got to take a step back every once in a while and figure out how we fit into this puzzle and figure out how we can, serve and help others. It's not about us. So.
That's a great closing. I don't want to add too much on top of it. Let's close with that. That is a great way. Kelly Murphy, I really appreciate it. Seriously, this has been a pleasure, and I'm glad I got to know you a little bit. But I'm going to shoot you an email with the book and everything, so that I need you to read that book.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
I'm gonna have some serious questions, but no, super impressive stuff. Really, really happy that we got to do this, and stay safe during these wild times, and hopefully we can cross paths sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right. Have a good one.
All right. You too. Bye.